Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. A couple of weeks ago, I did a video based on a piece by this fellow named Matt D, and he wrote another thing that I want to talk about today. It says, on Shawn Michaels' deconstruction of pro wrestling, nihilism, and the Young Bucks. So basically, he's going to draw a line between Shawn Michaels and the Young Bucks. And I want to add Kenny Omega to this as well, because I saw a video where Kenny Omega talked about his philosophy on pro wrestling, or his idea of what pro wrestling should be. And I'm going to throw that in here too. But first, I'm not going to read all of Matt's piece, but his name is at MattD_SC if you want to read the entire thing on Twitter. So he says, it all started with Shawn Michaels. Michaels was no fool. He knew how it worked. He knew what it would take. He knew what he had and what he didn't have, and the way the world was moving. To get ahead in the WWF, to get all the way to the top, you had to be huge. He was a lot of things, but that wasn't one of them. So he leaned hard into the idea of being the showstopper. On some level, it worked for a blustery heel. Maybe couldn't beat the top baby faces, but he could claim to be the most exciting. As he did become the top act, however, and did go babyface, it made less and less sense. What value did having the most exciting match have in a world of wins and losses? This is an excellent point. All right. The point of pro wrestling is to win the match and to get the people to believe that you are going to win the match, not that you're the most exciting. Being the most exciting is fine if you're just trying to win the fans over, but the fans should believe that you are, simply put, the best team. To use a regular sports analogy, there was a part where I think it was the St. Louis Rams, or were they still the Los Angeles Rams at the time? And they were called the greatest show on turf. And they were the most exciting team in the NFL. And that helped because they were winning games. If they were the most exciting team and they lost all the time, most people really wouldn't have cared. But because they won most of the time, did they win the Super Bowl that year? Let's take a look. Okay, so they did win the Super Bowl in 1999, and it was the St. Louis Rams. I was going off memory. So the St. Louis Rams, Mike Tyson was one of the most exciting professional boxers of all time, but it was because Mike Tyson won most of the time. So that kind of is part and parcel of how this thing works, is you really don't care about the performance element of it, but you do have to care that you're winning and losing. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit. It says, regardless, he, being Shawn Michaels, shifted the metric of success away from getting an audience to suspend their disbelief and more towards the idea of match quality. ROH would double down on that, embracing the counterculture smart wrestling fan and the idea of great dream matches to anchor cards. Michaels had hit a wall, had known that he would never be able to climb it, and he worked to tear it down, at least in part. That the wall was load-bearing didn't matter. All that mattered was getting ahead. In other words, this is Chesterton's fence. You don't know why a fence is there. You don't supposed to touch it. But Shawn, in this guy's formulation, because I would actually say it might have been other people too, but Shawn might be the preeminent one in terms of national television. Saw why things were the way they were, why, size mattered and certain psychology and things of that sort worked, and saw to subvert that to a degree. And he successfully did it. And I think through being the showstopper, he was able to get people to believe in him as a punching above his weight sort of babyface that was able to go in there one-on-one with Diesel, and go in there one-on-one with Vader, and go in there one-on-one with Sid, where previous years they would not have really believed in that. So I get it. He says, years later, the Young Bucks hit a wall of their own. They didn't have the size, they had the sizzle, but then so did everyone around them. They could work conventional tag matches, but the crowd wasn't going to come along with them. So much like Michaels, they had the new idea. They deconstructed the idea of wrestling even further. Winking wasn't enough. They spat. And in doing so, they invited a subsection of fans along with them. So, much like the Click, winked and nodded it at, kayfabe and all the stuff that WWF, the event supposedly hated, the curtain call, but they insisted on doing it because it was at a house show. Again, these sorts of things were kind of on the fringe. And then eventually their real life friendship becomes part of the storyline. Their real life friendship becomes part of the interplay between WCW and WWF. It becomes integral in DX. And getting DX over was how realistic it was that these guys were really friends and they weren't really enemies and all this kind of stuff, right? You just winking and nodding at the audience. He says, there was no longer a need for separation between wrestler and fans. Those old rules and boundaries that protected the business and seemed antiquated in the 2010s just got in their way. So what if it helped to keep up the suspension of disbelief and preserve the meaning of specific moves and tropes within a shared narrative culture? In other words, guys getting up immediately from power drivers, that sort of thing. There's stories that are told about power drivers and power bombs and smashing through tables and getting hit with chairs and all these sorts of things, all the acrobatics. How stories are told and how they manage to make sense. You didn't see Shawn completely and totally destroy certain moves. Even if he kicked out of things that he maybe should not have kicked out of, maybe as he took punishment that maybe it was seemed unrealistic for him to take, he still was a sensible pro wrestler, even at the time. Even when he was in his quote-unquote Superman stage, Shawn still took a hell of a beating, and he sold incredibly well. All of the progenitors, I guess you could say, of what Shawn Michaels would do later, those people stopped selling. And it's become less and less relevant to sell today than it was in 1996, 1997, when Shawn was at his peak. We talk about this all the time. Guys like Will Ospreay will get tombstones on stairs and then be right back up and running 30 seconds later. There was a big deal made out of Nathan Fraser working his tag team championship match shortly after the Iron Survivor Challenge, and he had like the broken nose and the ribs, and he was still doing 450 splashes and Phoenix splashes from the top rope, and none of that makes sense. And if you're already hurt, why would you be jumping off the top rope and landing on your own ribs? It just doesn't make sense, right? So what we're seeing is that he's, again, drawing a line from Shawn doing these amazing acrobatics and punching above his weight in terms of story by using match quality to get himself over, to these guys now saying match quality can get me over, so I really don't need to adhere to the conventional wrestling bits. And you could add the Hardy Boys to this to a degree, but not so much. That would be more the crash and burn style stuff, where the Hardys were some of the progenitors of, jumping off ladders and falling through tables and all that kind of shit. That would come later. But it only added to the fact that guys stopped selling so much, because it popularized guys crashing through tables and guys jumping off ladders, and you continue in the match after you crashed through a table and jumped off a ladder. So let's move forward. He says they became a new sort of heel, one that was the enemy to the very notion of pro wrestling. He's talking about the Young Bucks. While Punk and Danielson were shattering the glass ceiling in WWE, they were lowering the floor. In doing so, they invited a whole new generation in. Another wall torn down, they found success. They claimed their creative freedom. They brought their wrestlers and thousands of fans along the way for the ride. They did it all the way to the bank, becoming great successes. The problem was, this time around, the water started to come in. Great matches for the sake of great matches lead to a sort of escalation that is likely not sustainable. The human body can only do so much. People can only be so wild. This is exactly what traditional pro wrestling fans have always said about, guys doing too much. I know that Meltzer is a huge reason why these guys are doing what they do. Of course, we cannot let that go, right? Meltzer is a huge reason why these guys are doing what they do. The Young Bucks being voted into the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame because they were stars in Japan and stars on the indies. I put those two things in quotes, I'm talking about stars, is largely because Meltzer has been one of the biggest PR firms for the Young Bucks for the last 15 to 20 years. All right. When you actually look at the Young Bucks, they maybe have main evented some small indie shows, but when it comes to bigger indies in Japan, etc., they were never the main event. You know, when it came to being, guys who were a draw, they were never really the big draw. I mean, they were important members of the Young Bucks. I mean, not the Young Bucks, but of the Bullet Club. But they were more like the New Age Outlaws of the Bullet Club. They were the guys who were hitched to the Bullet Club as it was already started. We've talked about that before. They were never the meat of the group. They were always the sizzle. They never really meant that much. But they were able to parlay that into, with the help of Dave Meltzer, that they're the greatest tag team of all time. They're the greatest tag team in the United States. They're the greatest indie tag team of all time, all sorts of things. To the point where people tend to believe it. They actually believe it, and it's unfortunate. So here is some of the final paragraphs of Matt D. He says, the sort of nihilism of making the rules themselves the enemy is more unsustainable. It can be exciting for nothing to matter for a while, but eventually it becomes exhausting. It doesn't last the test of time. All of the most timeless, primal elements of pro wrestling matches have been worn out. Then he says, walls have to be rebuilt and restored. One that can hold up meaning and worth. Maybe everything truly had to be broken in order to be rebuilt and to collapse the monolithic system. But now it's time to embrace the genuine once more and offer people something more. So basically, he's talking about how in one of the paragraphs that I skipped, he talked about how the Young Bucks cashed in on all their nihilism and that they no longer have earnest matches. So this is an important bit. And by earnest matches, he means that matches that make sense, where wins and losses actually matter, etc. But these are matches where all they care about is performance level. Now, you'll talk to people and all they care about the Young Bucks. They say, oh, they're so loved by the older generation, and why do these fans hate them? And they completely forget that each time, especially the most recent time they were voted into the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame, they were not voted in because all the old wrestlers liked them. They were voted in because all the journalists and reporters love Dave Meltzer and have been reading about them for years and think that every match or every other match is 5 stars and fantastic. Therefore, they got voted into the Hall of Fame. So it's not because they were huge draws everywhere they went or because they have such substantial matches. It's because they created the concept of spectacles, the 5-star dream match, quote unquote. But most of these matches they're fruit pies, They may smell good, they may even taste good to a degree, but they're not filling and they're really kind of corrosive to the body of pro wrestling in general. Now we're going to add Kenny Omega to the bit because one of the AEW fans found an old Kenny Omega video from 2014. And I want you to listen to what he actually says about pro wrestling and see if this doesn't actually fit what we're talking about here today.
I didn't want to hang on too much about the past of wrestling or try to achieve like what they did or look like what old wrestling used to look like, because I think old wrestling actually sucks pretty bad, in my opinion.
Not all of it holds up.
No, not all. No, certainly not all of it. Some of it I can watch it, and there are some things that no one does anymore that look really cool. And if I could ever remember any of it, I would try to implement it because it actually looks like awesome. But for the most part, it's just like really like weird. It looks like kind of like old men fighting, Like everyone's like kind of really robotic and Yeah, I didn't.
So the idea is to turn pro wrestling into Street Fighter 2 Turbo rather than fully understand what you're and engage with what you're watching. Of course, Kenny Omega, I think he plays some athletics, but for the most part, he was a theater kid, and he doesn't really get it. He doesn't really understand sports. For him, it was all about performance. He said, it was like old men fighting. It was weird stuff like that. And people like that in the business. It has done irreparable damage to people's perceptions of wrestling, what it should look like, and how it should be. I think giving Shawn Michaels some of the blame is fair because I think he did do some of that. But if you want to compare Shawn to Kenny Omega to Will Ospreay, well, I guess you can say there are bits of what Shawn Michaels did in what Will Ospreay does. But that floor has fallen completely through now. I mean, Ospreay is about the same size as Shawn Michaels, but we've seen Ospreay survive pretty much everything except a rocket launcher to the face. And it seems very excessive. But if I may close on Kenny Omega, I think Omega has been one of the more influential guys, especially in the 2010s, in terms of taking what Shawn Michaels is being blamed for in this article and ratcheting it up to the highest level. And part of that is because of Japan. Japan is not getting enough blame for what's happening here. Because Japan got pretty bad. When it Misawa and Kenta Kobashi and these guys were dropping each other on their heads. I think it was Misawa versus Kobashi where there was literally a tiger suplex off of a ramp. And if you know a tiger suplex, it's like you grab a guy's arms and pull him back so he can't defend himself and then threw him off the ramp so that Kobashi landed on his head and neck. And they continued the match after that. It just continued to go. And these matches always get 5 stars from Meltzer, no matter how many neck bumps that they kick out of. Because, and these guys were bigger, they were burlier, it was supposed to be a psychology to it. And these things are packed into what people think pro wrestling should be today. They couldn't imagine back in 1982 that you're going to throw a guy off a ramp onto his own head and it's not going to be an ambulance spot. The guys themselves wouldn't think that. A regular wrestler wouldn't think, you're going to drop me on my head on the floor and we're going to get up and continue the match. The promoter, the fans, everyone else would be like, what? It would be obviously fake at that point. It would be obviously phony. But it's a spectacle. It would wow the reporters and all those people. And so they wouldn't have done it. Or they would have done it, but it would have been part of a 6-month or 4-month storyline. Nowadays, you don't even remember it if they throw somebody off of a ramp and they land onto their head. It's not even remembered 2 weeks later because they do it so much and because nobody believes anything. So Kenny Omega is part of this. I would say that he took what, Shawn Michaels is being blamed for to the next level, and then Will Ospreay is going even further than that. So heavens to Bessie, who knows what's going to happen in the future. But I generally agree that thinking about match quality more than wins and losses has been a tremendous negative to pro wrestling. Getting people to believe that wins and losses matter, that moves matter, that moments matter as bits and pieces of the overall story, that's important. But a lot of that is the wrestling media's fault and the changing tastes, the tastemakers in the wrestling media, like Meltzer, like all the guys who give every Young Bucks and Kenny Omega match 5 stars, regardless of how ridiculously long it is, regardless of how terrible the psychology is. For instance, you running away from a standing opponent, turning your back on your opponent, the unnecessary posing, the unnecessary amounts of choreography. I mean, and Randy Savage should get a little bit of blame for this too, especially for the unnecessary choreography, because that was more of his thing. But how phony a lot of the matches look today, is it fair to trace it back to Shawn Michaels? To a degree, yes. But to think that it hasn't been ratcheted up to an ungodly amount today, oh my goodness. Now it's almost completely separate from what pro wrestling should be. And it's almost like this is the real sports entertainment. Is the fact that a guy would stand in position for 40 seconds while you pat the mat, run in the opposite direction, and then run back and jump over the top rope. He's going to stand right there in that position for 2 minutes while you do all this. Everybody's going to cluster up together so you can jump off the top rope. That's almost more like sports entertainment than, 15-minute promos. I know that Roman Reigns catches a lot of shit for not doing a lot in his matches and not wrestling that often. But like he said himself, he gets a lot of reaction just by saying yeet. But while these guys have to do 450 tombstone power drivers only for the match to be forgotten in 2 weeks. But let me know what you guys think, and I'll talk to you folks later.
Yeah. We're just gonna